James, when you and I were in our early 20s talking about God, we never really talked about whether God exists. We kind of assumed that God exists. We're asking all complicated questions about what that God was doing and what we should do and all of that. And subsequent to that and various things I've done, I've begun to look very seriously at the arguments for and against God. You've looked at religion very historically. So we've had different perspectives over these many years. And bringing it together, one of the arguments that people give me, arguing for the existence of God, in addition to the usual stuff about the universe, is looking particularly at miracles and revelation as if not a knockdown proof, one of the strongest proofs that they use. And you know what they focus on. They focus on the resurrection of Jesus. You've done some important work in this area. You've published a very well-known book, The Jesus Dynasty. Let's go through it. Can you use the resurrection of Jesus to prove the existence of God?
You know, I'm not sure that any literary report of any miracle could ever get close to verifying the miracle. So we've got that problem from the outset. But historians work mostly with texts. Sometimes we have material evidence. So if we found a Jesus tomb, that would be significant. But generally work with texts. And in terms of the resurrection of Jesus, it's not as though one would assume in just opening the Bible and reading it. The first thing you have to know is that Paul, who is the great advocate of resurrection, is actually our earliest witness. But he's about 20 years after the death of Jesus. Jesus dies in 30, Paul starts writing in the 50s. He's really the source then, you know, if you take it chronologically, of this notion, you know, I saw Christ, I saw the vision of Christ, heard his voice, and so forth. And he doesn't mention the empty tomb. He just begins testifying to his faith in this risen Christ. And so what we have to do then is look at our other sources. See, normally people read the Gospels first and then Paul.
Right.
So you assume that the first thing was the Gospel and then Paul, but actually Paul was first.
In terms of committing it to writing.
Committed to writing. So Mark, which is the earliest Gospel, about 70 AD, is taking us 40 years after the time. But here's the amazing thing about Mark. He's writing around 70 AD, Jesus dies in 30, and he has no appearances of Jesus. Jesus dies, he's buried in this tomb temporarily. The women come to the tomb, it's empty, and the gospel closes. This is in our earliest manuscripts. That means that we have a community in the 70s AD that must not have known, or at least testified to what Paul seems to think is just bedrock faith, visions of Christ and so forth. And then you go to Matthew, the next gospel, and you'd think, oh, finally we'll get some visions and revelations of Christ. And what do we find? Empty tomb again. The disciples go to a mountain in Galilee, and there they see him, it says, but some doubted. So you get this one account. Mark has nothing. Matthew has one account. And it sounds like a misty mountain experience. And what was that experience? It's not touching his body, seeing his wounds, all the things that you see in the movies. That's still much later to come. But it's just this sense that although he has died, perhaps his presence lives on, you know, this sort of affirmation. When you go to the later two Gospels, Luke and John, which now is putting us into the 80s and even 90 AD by most chronology, you do finally get stories of Jesus saying, touch me, I'm not a ghost, look at my wounds, you know, the famous doubting Thomas story. I see this as progressive. That is, I don't think the earliest Christians are telling the same story as Paul, and I don't think they're telling the same story as these later texts. You've got a kind of development going on here. I'm trying to reconstruct in my own work now what I call the dark ages of Christianity. And the dark ages are the years from 30 to 50 before Paul. And I have begun to entertain the shocking possibility that Christianity continued after Jesus' death without proclaiming the resurrection, which is just unheard of. Now, proving it is another thing, but if within the record, the earliest followers weren't even believing in it, which normally is not even thought of. You know, people, well, of course, the main thing is he died, he was raised, and that's what started the movement.
And the argument is that one of the so-called proofs that they believed it was the fact that many of them became martyrs and sacrificed their lives for this. And would they have done that for some ephemeral hope? But the fact that they really believed that they saw Jesus, whether they did or not is another story, but they believed it themselves and therefore were willing to sacrifice their lives. That's part of the argument.
Well, eventually, but who sacrifices his or her life? I mean, Paul finally is martyred under Nero. He certainly believes it, but he's really our first witness to this notion. What I think very well might have happened, they did regain their faith after the death of Jesus, but I think they regained it by the leadership of Jesus' brother, virtually unknown. This is what my book, The Jesus Dynasty, is about. That there's a family of royal Davidic, the family of David was the Messianic family. And Jesus has these 4 brothers. And when Jesus dies...
Part of the apostles.
Part of the apostles. When Jesus dies, James takes over the leadership. This is James, the brother of Jesus. And that when he finally dies in 62, it's very interesting. He's asked by the Jewish priest, and the only account that we have, his enemy actually, do you believe in your brother Jesus as the returning heavenly being? Why would he be asked that if this is his whole teaching, Christ is in heaven, my brother is ruling at the right hand of God? And what he says is quite interesting. He doesn't say yes or no. He says, you will see the Son of Man coming in heaven, which Christians say, oh, that's Jesus. But actually we know from the book of Daniel, he's just quoting a prophetic passage.
So he's saying something that would resonate in their minds as something that's part of their culture.
Their culture, and not necessarily Jesus. This is radical. I think it's something new that's just developing among some scholars. But it's trying to interpret what happened right after the death of Jesus without jumping 20 years to Paul and assuming that that's the master account. Now, most people, do you know the book of Acts? Of course you do. It's the story of the days following the death of Jesus. That's from 80 or 90 AD.
What's our confidence level of being able to date the Gospels and the book of Acts as significantly posterior to Paul in their writing?
It's very high.
Why?
Because of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. It's like today, if you're before or after World War II, you can tell if you mention the Holocaust or things like this. It's very similar. In 70 AD, the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. Right. It was the most devastating event in Jewish history of that period within several hundred years. You can read in the later Gospels, Luke particularly, and Acts, and they're referring to this as if it's past, even though they're telling the life of Christ, of Jesus. It's just the language.
Some would say that's prophetic, though.
Some would say it's prophetic, but if you compare it to Mark, it's really clear that Luke is interpreting it, I think, after the fact. I mean, this is how we have to work as historians with the evidence we have. So if that's the case, we need to ask, is there any document surviving that would give us this other picture? And in fact, there are 2. One is a embedded text in Luke and Matthew that we call Q, that refers to Jesus as the teacher and so forth, nothing about resurrection. And the other was discovered in the 1890s. It's called the Didache. It also presents Jesus, but not as the one raised from the dead. And so I think this it's sort of this lost Christianity, this lost view of Jesus that
So what you're
I'm
saying,
trying to recover.
What you're saying is where you personally may or may not believe in God, perhaps you do, you would not use the resurrection of Jesus as proving that.
I don't think it can be argued at all the way the apologists argue it as this bedrock fact of all history. If anything, it's one of the most insecure claims to miracles, I think, that one could appeal to.